and welcome back to the show, Business Mastery for Startups, Scale-Ups, and Early Stage Businesses with your host, Jerry Gadori. That's me. And this week, we're fortunate to have Grace McCarrick, the culture coach, to talk to us about, well, lots of stuff to do with how employees interact in the workspace, regardless of what shape that might take. So, Grace, quick introductions. Could you introduce yourself for us?
Of course, Jerry. Thank you for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
Thanks
We
for
always have
coming.
such good conversations, so I'm happy to have another one. I am Grace, the culture coach. That is my name on social media, where I've gotten a bit of a following talking about work. A couple of years ago, I built a program that lives at the intersection of culture and learning and development, because I think to have a culture in this evolving world, to have a culture that works for us, we really need to scale our employees in order to for them to be able to get where we want them to go. So that's what I do. I've been running that program for a couple of years, and then I'm on social media having some, sometimes controversial takes about what it takes to be successful in the working world right now.
Everybody loves a hot take.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that intersection is interesting. It will surprise no one who's followed any of my work. We talk about culture within a company a lot, and it's a lot less about a good or a bad culture, though there are certainly both of those. It's more about finding a culture that matches you and your personal internal mission and values. And even more than that, I find that the workplace is evolving such that the way that we view employment is changing. So, in other words, to say that less cryptically, the relationship between employer and employee isn't the same. Even 20 years ago, there was an expectation that you're the employer and this is the employee, an almost feudal relationship where you're thankful to have a job. And that hasn't been the case for 20 years. But now, at least in the companies that I'm finding thriving, the relationship has changed such that the company looks at the employee as a long-term partner, and they stay together as long as their missions align, what they're trying to achieve aligns. And that often comes up to what you were just mentioning, Grace, and that's how the person is growing within the
Yep.
organization and within their own skills and responsibilities.
Totally. I like to think of it like the evolution of how a good culture was articulated, right? So in the 80s, like 80s, early 90s, a good fresh culture, they talked about each other as a family, right? Now we're like, that couldn't be more dated. Really good modern cultures that are doing this in an innovative way, they're talking about themselves like teams, like sports teams or work teams. So yeah, it's just one of the funny trends.
Just that by itself could be a topic because it's so interesting. I remember before that, I was born in the 70s, grew up in the 80s. But looking back to listening to my dad work, again, there was this relationship where, again, almost a feudal lord, there was no concept of family. So as much as we look at that now as dated, in the 80s, that was innovative. Think, caring enough about a person to consider them family was different. But I agree with you. Not only is it dated, I think it sends a little bit of the wrong message. The way
The
families
family.
interact versus teams are two very different things. In a team, I'm going to get traded out for lots of reasons: budget, skill, whatever. You don't get traded out of a family, excluding divorce. So yeah, I like the evolution and concept to team a lot more. I personally like it even more looking at it as a partnership.
I really like how you frame it as a sort of could be a short or long term partnership between the company, and I think that is probably where we will continue to evolve. I think there's a lot of companies and a lot of employees who are not yet ready for that. That requires like equal participation on both parts,
Yes.
and so that's really hard. What the evolution that we're seeing though that's really interesting is I like how you talk about this sort of like feudal lord, but it really was, the boomers were the first generation that was individualistic. So the boomers were the first generation to wake up and go, I don't care if everyone else in my neighborhood is a nurse or this or that. I want to do the thing that I want to do. Every other generation, so silence and sort of before that, were very influenced by their collectivist culture, right? So boomers sort of broke the mold on that. In breaking the mold on that, you start to change all of your motivation being external into this now intrinsic motivation. So the feudal, like, I think it's funny. We think that our parents and our grandparents were so sort of like trodden down by these workplaces, but in reality, their you know their fight for survival was very different than even what we feel
Yes,
today.
100%. Yeah.
So to be in a company that offered you stability and benefits and a paycheck, like that was huge. That was enough. You didn't need to be fulfilled. You didn't need to be spiritually challenged. You didn't need to be growing. You needed to be in some place that was stable, because that would have been different than their siblings and their parents. And for a lot of people, there was prestige in that. Like, oh, my son works at the airline. My son is a lawyer. So we also are wrestling with the fact that our motivations have changed so drastically. And now what we're looking at is a new generation with entirely new motivations around work. And so how do we introduce them in?
What you said that I think is most interesting. So I'm an enormous fan of everyone's least favorite superpower, and that's the R word that's so loathed, responsibility.
Sure.
So what you described is the trade-off between security and freedom. So older generations had a very secure work environment where there was an implied requirement of the authority figure to provide for. I'm going to go back to my original example. The feudal lord had to take care of their peasants, or else the peasants had an uprising. The feudal lord got to fill a ditch with his body. So, so maybe not that extreme in the workplace, but that was the concept. And as we move forward, we're trading that security for the ability to make your own choices. Now, keep in mind, everything I say is heavily influenced by the fact that I work in the tech space. So the concept of a gig economy really originated there, or at
Mm-hmm.
least the majority of it did. So as we move forward, the reason, and I could be wrong, time will tell, but the companies that I'm seeing are thriving when they're looking at working with a person, regardless of what generation they're in. They're looking for someone to fill a role and ideally to be a cultural match that they can grow inside the organization. The companies that are really thriving are sharing that message with the candidate when they're talking to them. So they're saying, so Grace, does this, and they say it more eloquently, this, I'm being concise, but does this represent a logical next step in your career? This is our
Mm-hmm.
mission and values. Do they align with your mission and values? This
Yep.
is what a career path within our company would look like. Does that align with what you're looking for? If these answers are yes, then that partnership will probably be long term. That same company in the next interview might say something like, Grace, we have to build this infrastructure. Once it's built, it takes 7 people to build a road, 1 to maintain it. So I'm not going to need you after that. And if you're cool with that, then that becomes a short-term partnership. But the reason why I say done right is when it's done right in that second example, you're here for 3 months, 6 months, however long it takes to build that internal infrastructure. You leave happy because you were dealt with respectfully, expectations were set, kept, and maintained. Your project is done, so you leave. 6 months, a year, 3 years from now, another opportunity comes. There's no universe where you're not going to want to come back.
Yep.
So I think that's really the big difference. But you're right; it really pushes the responsibility into the hands of the individual, because they've got to make those choices.
Well, I work a lot in like deep corporate. I work in like really conservative, corporate insurance finance law
That
firms.
sounds like a conspiracy theory. Deep corporate,
Yeah, I know. I know.
or
I said,
an awesome '80s punk band.
yes,
Deep corporate.
I can see it. Um, but I love working in corporate environments, mostly because they kind of have the swing right now to be able to apply some resources in different places, make some pivots. But what I really want corporate team members to do, and I'm saying this because tech is where a lot of this stuff bubbles up earlier, right? Like the gig economy and the contractors. I want corporate team members to think of themselves like contractors. I
Yes.
want them to think of themselves like, here are the skills I'm bringing to the table. Here's how I can apply them to this work. And I mean both tech skills and soft skills.
Yes.
And then I want them to feel that choice. Like, I'm making a choice to do this work with this company and be here for this reason. And it completely changes the way people then think about their work long term, because a lot of, there's so much malaise right now. There's so much like, ugh, work. And we've talked about this a couple different times. Like, there's a couple reasons for this. There's this underlying anti-work sentiment on social media that regardless of whether you buy into it or not, it's getting drilled into the back of people's brains.
Yes.
It is like, and what happens, what I like to tell team leaders is the minute someone gets disappointed at work, that story starts to rise up from the back of their brain where it's been hiding after watching all these reels and all these TikTok videos and all these memes about work taking advantage of you.
Can I jump in there for one quick second? I'm very sorry to interrupt. I just don't want to talk past that part. You said something that doesn't get talked about enough. You, and I'm picking on you because it's the two of us talking. You, Grace, might not believe that. You might say to yourself, I'm happy here. This is fine, whatever.
Yep.
But you see all of those TikToks and reels and you read those posts on LinkedIn. So it's a socially accepted position, a socially acceptable position to have. So now something does happen and you're bothered by it. You've got the easiest crutch in the world to lean back on and say, well, it's not me. This company sucks. Everybody knows all companies suck. Just look at social media.
Well, not only that, we also have we have this obsession with like, what is the exact reality? And I think this is probably part of growing up in an internet age where we have access to so much information. And so yes, it is a crutch. And I think a lot of people use crutches now, but it's also people are in an effort to go, wait, is my whole reality a lie? Like, none of these people care about me? Does no one want my growth here? Am I actually just like, I could jump out the window tomorrow, they wouldn't know. So that sort of thing starts to happen because they're getting that in the background. It's almost like a tape running in the background all day long.
Yeah.
They're getting it all the time. And their ability to say, I choose to be here for this reason. I choose to trade my skills and my time and my energy for this project, for this work, for this company. You take yourself out of that spin.
Agree. I will say, I think this supports what you're saying. Trust in authority and organizations is at an all-time low. I think that the Congress, and this is as close to politics as I'm ever going to get, but the trust in the Senate and Congress is like the lowest on record. The president's approval rating is somewhere, between 0 and not high enough to matter. And that extends past that to education. Like we look at the educational institutions, they're getting beat up for a million different things.
See that line?
Yep.
1975 to 2015, 12th graders trust in institutions.
Yeah. So that's exactly what we're talking about. So it's almost like being involved with somebody who is in an abusive relationship. You can be great, but the second something happens that reminds them of that other situation, suddenly you're guilty of the same sins as that prior partner. Same concept here. And again, to your point, constantly reinforced in social media. Social media
Totally.
could be a conversation all on its own.
Very much so.
So I don't want to spend a half an hour complaining. So let's talk about knowing this and how we use it.
Yeah, so I think it's important to set the stage. So a lot of what I talk about when I work with my program, with teams on my program, it's the how. How are we doing things? The why is important to understand, but I don't like to spend a ton of time on the why. I think you got to set the stage. You have to know what are the factors here? Like, why is this the way it is? And then we're not going to dig further in that. We're going to go, okay, knowing that this is the way it is, how do we move beyond that? How do we move past that? And yeah, I mean, you talked about this, like sort of the gig economy, the contract. I mean, there's some really interesting books. I'm looking at 2 right now, Reinventing Jobs and Work Without Jobs. Concepts about how, over the next 15 years, we start to change the concept of a full-time employee, a full-time employer, and like what that looks like and what different versions. There's a really interesting chapter on companies that do, it's almost like, do you ever in college, how kids would go, like you'd be in a college in New York and then you'd go for a semester to a college in Italy?
Well, somewhat different. I went to college in the Marines, so I went to college in Scotland, North Carolina, all over the place.
Okay. Little different. But the idea that you sort of swap where you are a company. So you're like doing marketing in this type of company, and then they have a relationship with this other company and you get to go over there for a year or 2 years, whatever. So that kind of stuff is all interesting to me, like once we start to detach that full-time employee relationship. But then I think skilling is the biggest thing you can do. The biggest
100%.
thing any company can do right now is skilling.
I couldn't agree more.
And Jerry, 50% of people born after 1995 did not work for pay during high school.
Wow. I started working when I was 9. My senior year in high school, I worked full time.
And what'd you do?
So at 9, I worked on a farm until I was old enough to get a work permit, because working on a farm is hard work. So I became a dishwasher, and then I worked at convenience stores through high school. And then when I graduated high school, I took a gap year. That's code for I partied a lot.
Sure.
And I had 2 full-time jobs then. I kept the convenience store and I worked in a machine shop. And then I joined the Marines. So.
Okay. There's this funny thing on social media, this like escapism form of thought where people are like, I don't want to work. I just want to go work on a farm. And I'm like, have you ever been on a farm?
Yeah. That is the hardest work I've ever done.
It is way more like you don't get a weekend. The animals, they still wake up at 5 a.m. just the same.
Yeah, I worked on a vegetable farm, and the seasons do as the seasons do, and you do what the seasons do. I was an 80s metal kid, hair down to my butt. I looked like a derelict, but I was a kind of goody-goody. I never skipped school except one time. The one time I skipped school, the farm I worked at called my mom the night before and said, there's an early frost this year. I hate to ask, can we have Jerry tomorrow? I skipped school, and I was on the field at 4:30 in the morning until 9 that night. We filled every vehicle that farm owned with squash and pumpkins. And by the time we're done, I literally had worn the skin off the tips of my fingers, and they were cracked and bleeding. It was, farms are hard. I can clearly talk to you until time ends, so I'm going to get off of this tangent. I want to circle back to your skilling.
What I'm going to say with that tangent, it actually is helpful because there's a lot of people probably listening to you who can empathize with that. They worked, paper routes, whatever, since they were young. As this is a civilization challenge, right? This is not some big, existential issue like our kids are getting weaker or whatever. This is because people like you who worked so freaking hard since they were 9 years old, got successful, made some money, and went, if my kid wants to go to science camp or study or do something else while they're in high school, I want them to have the opportunity to do that. That's why this happens. Say it again.
I literally did that. My kids went to art camp and all that stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's okay. This is just the way our civilization is going. It's actually a good thing. These kids are living safer, more secure childhoods than we ever did. Forget any generation before. So they just need different skills because we have the assumption right now in workplaces that people have spent some series of years working and understanding how to work with other people, understanding what professionalism is, understanding how to respect authority, how to do a good work product, how to take pride in it, how to be on a team. We think they have those experiences coming into work. They're less and less of them have them. And so the basic shit that you need to scale people on feels so basic that the managers don't want to do it. And that's where I'm like, hi, I'm here. Let me do it. Come in. I got you. And it is this basic, like, what is professionalism in our company? What does it mean to be on a team in our company? How do we communicate with each other? I had a C-suite sales revenue person tell me this week that she had to tell one of her Gen Z employees not to call her babe on a call.
Oh my gosh, yeah.
Yeah.
That can be problematic.
And these are funny, these are funny things we put on the internet, but at the same time, they're if they don't know, we're first of all not going to come down so hard on these 20-year-olds for not knowing stuff, but let's teach them. And then when you teach them, now you're growing those leaders in your own company.
Yeah, you hit on something I want to talk, slight tangent, but super related. So the leadership framework that we teach is EFG, engage, fulfill, and grow. So engage with your team so they feel heard and valued, but also so you understand their strengths and weaknesses. Make
Yeah.
sure they're fulfilled, meaning that what they're doing makes them feel good about themselves. They're aligned with the mission and values of the company. And then growth, make sure their skills and responsibilities are growing. So if a leader is doing what they should, they're encountering the examples that you've given. That lady who said, "Don't call me babe on a meeting," obviously being a super easy example. But then how they deal with that is important. Because to your point, is it some 22-year-old guy trying to be snarky and clumsily assert dominance? Or is it a legitimate, just, I honestly can't imagine it, but being so not self-aware, thinking that level of casualness would be appropriate.
Oh,
And then doing some
I think that was
discernment.
a female in the
Oh,
example,
okay.
so I didn't think it was like trying to be, I don't think it was a misogynistic thing. No, I think most of the time, Jerry, like, and I'm talking to these kids online, it is cluelessness. I just
Yeah,
did a whole series, I think you saw some of it on LinkedIn, about how if you look more polished, you will be perceived as more competent. And the reason I did more than one video on it is because the arguments I got back and forth. So I ended up doing a video where I talked about how research says women who wear makeup, and I'm a woman, so I'm talking about this, like women who wear makeup
sure,
and
for
hair
sure.
done are seen as more competent. There was so much backlash that I went back and I filmed a video where I was like, okay, I'm gonna
I
have
saw it.
4 parts. Oh, you saw the video.
Yeah. It was great.
And but that's all part of the skilling. You have to go, I want you to look at me in my pajamas and tell me you feel the same way as looking at me like now, where I'm dressed up. And you don't. And you can't pretend that you think I'm just as competent in that video. Like, you can't pretend that. But you have to spell these things out.
Yeah, and but you touch on something that's so critical. So you're taking from the female perspective. It's equally true for guys. If I'm sitting down, so I'm dressed pretty casually, but when I first started out, we were expected to be in a full suit every day. If you showed up and forgot a piece of your suit, you were sent home. You weren't allowed to work. So it was a very different environment. But when it's a high impact thing for me, something I'm nervous about, something that's got high stakes, I still go full suit. Not just because of how I'm perceived, but because it's like armor. I feel more secure and more confident.
Totally.
And that's the part I think a
Totally.
lot of these folks are missing. Like, if you feel more confident, then you're going to react better. And if that means, full war paint and gear, then that's what that means. If
And I think Gen Z particularly they have this obsession with authenticity. And I think it must be from growing up with the internet, whatever it is. And so there's parts of them that are like, but it's not my authentic person to dress up like that. And you have to, and that's okay. And that can be the truth. And at the same time, what you have to know is this is a lever you have in your
yes,
pocket. So you have to figure out the way that it is authentically in you to dress up if you want to be perceived beyond, something sort of really basic.
yeah, I think I might have even commented this on your video. So if I remember right. But you touch on something that's important. We have no way to gauge a person until we interact with them. And the longer
Mhm.
that we interact with them, the more we can accurately gauge them. So our first impression we have of somebody before they say anything, since we, to the best of my knowledge, all lack telepathic abilities, the first thing we do is we look, how are they dressed? What do they look like? And that's not just a pretty privilege thing. That's a, did they take the time and did they have the respect to appear prepared for this situation?
Did they put in the
So,
effort? Did they have the
exactly
respect?
correct.
Mhm.
That's the first part.
Yeah.
The second part is once they do start to talk, we judge their communications. Not, again, necessarily, is that, I guess it is that. Not necessarily like where they're from, different regional dialects, but how do they speak? Can they articulate their thoughts? Can they speak professionally? If that person's making an interview example, representing my organization, am I comfortable with the way they comport themselves and they interact? Because that's an extension of my reputation. So that's the
Totally.
second thing that we judge, is how they communicate. And then
Well,
the
so
third,
that's a no, go, go, go.
no,
Third.
please, I'd say the third and final thing, we'll circle, doesn't matter, is the actual work. Once we get to know them, can they produce what they said they can do? But the point in
Right.
mentioning it is that's third. You might be a rock star, but if you can't talk it and you don't look it, you're not going to get to it.
I agree. And some people will, and some people get past that and they're geniuses, and that's fine. But for the rest of
I was
us,
just gonna say for the rest of us.
like I got to play the cards in my deck, man.
Yeah.
Well, what I think is interesting about what you just said, the talking and the communicating. So that's a big part of remote challenge right now. And we were talking about
Yes.
this before we started recording, which is there is so much about work and specific functions of work, sales, recruiting, these really people forward functions that is just about being in a room with other people who are doing it really well, who have a lot of
Yes.
experience, and watching the way they handle things. So this is the next level of skilling, right? So forget sort of basic professionalism stuff. You also have to be, if you have remote employees or you have a hybrid group, you got to be skilling them on the stuff that they would have just absorbed in office. How to work with team members, how to build client relationships, how to engage someone who's kind of flat, right? Like how to diffuse a situation, how to take a candidate who's kind of like falling off the cliff and bring them back on. All of these like people heavy interaction things. Now you have to explicitly spell them out.
100% yes. I in no way disagree with what you said. And I think we've spoken about this before. One of the hard things in that hybrid and that remote environment is getting to do that in a meaningful way. So I know in different organizations I've worked with and consulted for, we've done lots of different things. We tried that everybody leaves their camera on and we're in this big group Zoom, and that wound up just feeling like 1984. That wound up just creepy. It didn't work at all. We tried having like online hours where we did that at specific times so you
Yep.
could hear. What we wound up doing ultimately was scheduling shadow times where two people would get together, a senior person and a trainee or whatever it was, so that trainee could listen. I'm a big advocate of the me, us, you when it comes to people training and delegating. Watch me do it, then we're going to do it together, and then you're going to do it and I'm going to watch. So that type of a strategy, that worked really well. But still, if I'm being honest, it's still much more difficult to do that in a remote or a hybrid or remote scenario versus an in-office.
And I think because a lot of organizations, a lot of what I do when I'm sitting down with the team is I go, okay, we're going to go meta. Like you guys are not used to talking about how you work. You're just used to doing the work. Because I work with like high performing teams. So
For
you
sure.
guys are just used to going. So we're going to stop and go talk for a second about how it almost feels redundant. Like we're going to talk about how you're doing stuff. And organizations' inability to or lack of capacity to articulate, hey, the reason our salespeople do this on calls, the reason our recruiters do this on calls is because of this. And not in some, forced values way, but like we know that our role in the market is like we're the rebel. We're the company that's doing it differently. So we got to kind of come across that way in calls. And so here's sort of the three things that I like to always hit as a senior recruiter in these calls. Like you have to talk about things in a way that's not work jargon.
Yes.
So that people can understand them.
Jargon, the very first blog post I wrote 9 or 10 years ago was on jargon. And I titled it The Great Divider. The purpose of jargon is to show whether you're in the tribe or out of the tribe. Because if you know my jargon, you're in the tribe. If you don't, you're out. And it's so easy to allow that to divide even inside of a team if you have new people. So that's a great example of jargon.
That's a great point.
Yeah. So, no, go ahead.
No. I was just going to say the part that you really have to get at in a remote world is that redundancy, which is or that piece which feels so redundant, which is okay, I'm gonna talk you through why we do the way we do this, and it's harder and people don't like it as much.
Yeah, I agree. And I'll say this about remote. Every company I've seen that's done it successfully using different strategies has found ways to create connection, because you are never going to open up to me as a person and make yourself vulnerable to learn unless you feel connected enough that you feel safe doing that. That's
Right.
never going to happen. So that needs to happen. But listen, We could clearly talk about this all day. I'd love to hear a little bit more about your services and how people can reach you. And quick note, folks, she's going to share contact info. I'll make sure it's in the show notes, so you don't need to grab a pen or anything. But talk more about the services you provide to the marketplace and how people can get in touch with you.
Oh, I appreciate you asking that, Jerry. So I have an accelerator program. It's a 6-hour program. I've tested it over the last 3 years. It's really to pull people in a team out of autopilot and into ownership, which you and I
I
agree
love that. Yeah.
is like the fastest way forward to success. So it's fun, it's interesting, it's connective. I focus on creating self-determination, creating cross-team allies, and operationalizing what's unique about each team. So that's my program. I can do it over the course of 6 weeks, or I can do it in one day. It's 6 hours. And then in the last 8 months, what has been burgeoning is my social media and sort of everything coming in off of that. So in addition to my program, I'll do like hour or 90-minute workshops for people who come in, depending on, they sort of come in and go, I like the way you're talking about this. We're having this type of work issue. Can you talk to my team? And so that's been a lot more of my life in the last couple months, which is fun as well. So you can find me on gracetheculturecoach.com. That's my website. On TikTok, I'm Grace the Culture Coach. And on LinkedIn, I am /Grace McCarrick, I think. I hope.
Awesome. And all those links will be in the show notes. So if there's corrections, you can just catch them there. So I'd love to talk more about your program another time, but this feels like a natural place to wrap up. So again, folks, make sure you check out Grace at the locations that she mentioned. Make sure you check us out at destinationemployer.co. In the interim, before we speak again next week, make sure you go do and make great things and continue to be awesome. Thanks again for being on the show, Grace.
Thank you so much for having me, Jerry. It was a pleasure of mine.
You're welcome.